This really started about a year and a half ago. The museum, Kristen Frederickson at the museum got a call from a group, a college in Philadelphia that wanted to have a Zoom program on Philadelphia trolleys for their senior members. And I wound up putting this together and had to show it in two separate parts because they had a lot of time issues. Um, I combined them for Hoosier, which I know some of you may have seen, and then I've done it for trolleyology, and I've added a few slides each time. And I did that today as well, so it's not quite the same slide. And of course, I used many, many sources. I can't do this by myself, and a lot of these were friends. Some are no longer with us, and then of course, lots of newspapers, lots of books. Um, to try to find information. Now, I went back to the very beginning, as Julie Andrews would say, and we're back in Philly in 1831. That's a stagecoach on, I believe, Market Street, and it's running. It's been run by James Boxell. It's an omnibus, is what we usually called it, and he started this very short omnibus service, 14 blocks between Second and 16th Streets, East West Line, and apparently was successful enough to spawn other separate companies. And by 1848, we have 18 lines in the city, over 600 people being employed to operate the cars, and I assume to maintain the coaches, do the work on the horse care. But there were 138 of these omnibuses running on the street. This is when a lot of us think about Philadelphia streetcars, with the coming of the horse car, and it's January 20th, 1858. You have the horse car 1 year before Pittsburgh, and there's a few Pittsburghers that seem upset when I am a guide and am giving tours. But that was a line on 5th and 6th Streets. It was a line built by a railroad, the Philadelphia and Delaware River Railroad. It had to get a supplement from its charter. And don't forget, back in this early day before the state constitution, um, cities could not give out franchises. You got your charter from the state legislature, or as some people would say, the General Assembly. They authorized this work, this new line in 1857, and it was called the Fifth and Sixth Streets line. Big success, so successful that by August of that year, the year it started in 1858, we have seven different horse car lines running, 50 miles or so of track. And within 2 years of the coming of this first horse car line, 18 railway companies, 18 street railway horse drawn companies are running. And they're all looking like this. All these cars are just so wonderful, 10 feet, 12, 14 feet long. The General Assembly was very interested in competition. They granted a lot of charters and they didn't want big systems. The charters generally included perpetual rights. 999 years for most of us, I think, is a perpetual time. And they gave them exclusive rights on the streets. So you got the right to Second and Third Street, as this car says. Nobody else is going to be able to operate on that street. And Philadelphians are still, I think, somewhat conservative. They were very conservative back then, and even the most progressive citizens did not like to see that. Now you have a lot of companies operating in, a very small area, which is what downtown Philadelphia was. There wasn't much movement north or west, actually, across the Schuylkill. So you have unrestricted competition, which is what the legislature wants. There's no profits to these companies, so why run the system? So what they did was basically put the third finger to the legislature. They formed a board of presidents. The long name, as I written down, Board of Presidents of City Passenger Railways. What that was they would have meetings and they would regulate the competition. They would all discuss fares and everybody would charge the same fare. Transfers were uniformly given out. Nobody really had the power to go against this board, and they were essentially shunned if they did. And I don't know where some of these. This I know is in Fairmount Park. The early horse car pictures, of course, we don't know where they are. And for the benefit of people who don't know what a horse car is, which is much of my non-trolley audience, these were expensive cars. Obviously, they were small cars. The operator had no protection, and these horses would only be working 4 to 5 hours a day. And so you had a lot of horses to take care of. You had a lot of teams. Um, and it's Gerard Avenue here. And I've talked to people about this. None of you have had dinner recently, right? But I saw actually statistics in New York for about the same period of time, and there were 150,000 horses they estimate were in New York, all dumping 20 or more pounds of fecal matter. Obviously, all urinating on the streets, all mixing in with people who don't wash for the most part. I mean, this was a real messy place, and the streets were obviously very, very messy. This is Chestnut Street, and you can only sell so much of this stuff to the local farmers. They were more than willing to buy what they needed, but there was a lot more. Steam dummies were tried. These were basically little tiny steam engines that are disguised to look like a passenger car, and they were very inefficient. I think there was one line up in Kensington and Frankfurt along Kensington Avenue, uh, down on Market Street, and they ran only from 1863 to 93, and they were noisy and they scared horses. They really weren't the solution for the mass transit. Anybody want to photograph at Broad Germantown in 1880? And this is what you would see: no Route 53, no Route 23, no Route 56. Um, Between 1857 and 74, though, you have 39 separate passenger railway companies chartered by the General Assembly. Okay, all wanting competition. That's what the General Assembly wanted. They would not permit the consolidation of any of these companies. They limited the amount of capital that was issued by these companies. It was illegal basically to merge any of these companies, to officially combine into one company. So people who wanted a bigger system quickly figured out the only way that we can get around this situation is to lease. Let's let me have enough money and I'll give you good terms and I will lease your system. Now the state constitution of 1874 shows up to eliminate a lot of excesses in the General Assembly. And one thing it does is forbid legislators or the legislature from granting any more charters. However, they didn't until 1889 come up with a way to actually incorporate new street railways. And so you want to get a bigger street railway, and I can't build one. I'm just going to have to go in and lease somebody else's. This is up in Old York Road, and you'll notice the track way at the sides of the street, what Dr. Cox called gutter running, which was very common in Philadelphia as you went out to the suburbs. So, you know, leasing was very profitable for the former owners because they're going to keep their stock, the stock they already have. In addition, if I want to lease, I'm going to give you good terms. And many times that was giving you a large rate of return. I'm going to maybe pay for all the track maintenance. I'm going to pay your taxes. Um, so you're the one making the money. Now, these three gentlemen show up, and I'm sorry that the man on the left, Mr. William Kemble, looks like he came out of the Twilight Zone. That's the only internet picture I was able to find. William Henry Kemble had worked in the silk industry. He did time as a federal revenue stamp agent. He was Pennsylvania's treasurer from 65 to 68, and of course joined the common machine in Philadelphia. There was a machine there, not just in New York. He was very influential, of course, and he used that influence to establish what was known as the Union Passenger Railway Company, and that was, I believe, a West Philly company. We know the guy in the center. That's Peter Errol Brown Widener. Um, And this guy would make a fortune selling sheep meat or mutton to the Union Army. Um, he made a lot of money, as you can see, and he took the $50,000 and invested it in the city's horse-drawn railways. He would become a Philadelphia politician. He would become the city treasurer in the 1870s, and as he was approaching the end of his life, he would be considered one of the most wealthiest of the 100 wealthiest Americans. And then William Elkins, of course, over on the right, born in 1832. He had his hand in a lot of things. He was a pioneer in the oil industry. He became successful selling produce. He got into the gasoline production and asphalt production industry. And um, Elkins would also get into street railways, became a very, very good friend with Widener. And they moved around out here in Pittsburgh. They controlled street railways, and I believe St. Louis and Cincinnati as well. This was Philadelphia traction. Um, Now, there were a few illegal consolidations as early as 1864, but what Widener and Elkins and Kimball did was found Philadelphia Traction Company, and it was a big holding company. Its intention was not to construct anything new. It wanted to gain control of everything else that was running, and they didn't care. It was either by lease or purchase, but purchasing, of course, was illegal. So they began to lease the other systems, and they would pay all the fixed charges, and they guaranteed some large dividends. So here's his system at the end of 1884. It's the consolidated interest of six of the original companies. It has a half interest in the seventh. And by 1885, it's controlling about 36% of the city's railway mileage or street railway mileage, carrying about 36% of all the passengers. There's the offices and depot of the West Philadelphia Passenger Railway. Um, the Philadelphia Traction was reorganized November 28th, 1888, and they utilized a law, the state law, that was actually influenced by these three gentlemen to create what was known as traction motor companies. And that act gave these motor companies a lot of powers. And you can see the quote, but I'll read it for you. They could invest their funds in the purchase of stocks and bonds of any corporation whose works, railway motors, or other property are leased, operated, or constructed by it. They could lease properties and franchises of passenger railway companies, any of which they wanted to operate, and they could operate those railways. So it essentially gave them, is what they said, vast powers. You gentlemen from Philadelphia, maybe Charlie Long's out there, maybe you recognize that building. I'd love to know at the end of the show where this intersection is. The way the date's put on tells me this is a Philadelphia Rapid Transit photograph. And you know, the governor signs the bill, and people are highly incensed in Philadelphia. But one man, Mr. Wayne McVeigh, he realizes that there's no way that you're not going to prevent all these systems from one day becoming a monopoly or a single system. I think Market Street here during subway construction, but a great picture. Um, these companies had no power to really build any track, and they had to charter small railways. Sometimes to use a Beach Street connecting railway, they need 200 feet of track to make a connection between the operating system and the powerhouse. And they had to construct a company, and that became yet another company that then had to be leased, and certainly would have to receive payments. This is 1908 during subway construction in Philly. Here we're looking from down Market Street from City Hall, and the city's growing. The cable cars will be settled on as a way to produce a faster transit system. They were running in other cities. About 75 cities would eventually attempt to try cable as an alternative to the horse. I think this is an eastbound view. And so I altered a map, which I believe was in one of Dr. Cox's books. And I hope people can see I think I've made it so you can see my pointer. And it was a really convoluted, unsuccessful history. Um, from 33rd at Fairmount Park, basically, to the powerhouse, they opened that up on April 7th of 1883, run it for a month and close it. Then the Philadelphia Traction gets involved, rebuilds the line, and extends it right around here, Franklin and Master, over here on the east or right side of my drawing. And then they opened it again. Now there's a line down on Market Street. They're going to run first from Haverford, 41st down to about 17th Street. That's the powerhouse. From there, they open that up in May of 1885. Then in June, about a month later, they opened up the rest of it, going down Market to Delaware Avenue. Meanwhile, the Columbia Avenue line closes again, September 1885. I've looked in available newspapers and it doesn't say why. What they do say is that after they build down to Sansom Street, they'll open it again, October 10th, 1886, and then extend it one more time to South Philly down to McKean Street, January 10th, 1888. And this is an off-scene view from City Hall looking at Broad Street Terminal, one of the cable cars with its trailer. Now, Widener was trying to save money. Instead of using the patented cable technology that was out there, he uses an experimental system, and that creates a lot of problems. And the cable system operation is suspended numerously. People look at it; it's erratic. They're willing to walk half a mile to get a horse car line because they know that horse car line is going to run. And that this cable system will end all operations in 1895. Now, Widener's going to talk about this later, and he's going to say, doggone it, I should have used the patents of the Cable Trust, and would have paid more money, but it may have been more successful. So who knows, if he had done that, would Philadelphia have had a much larger and maybe even a successful cable system? So meanwhile, events are going on in other places. And of course, those of you that come to Hoosier probably will see this picture on top. And that is November 29th of 1886. That's the trial run of the Scranton Suburban Railway number 4, the first successful electric streetcar operation. Yes, it does have a troller, but there's documentation that I found where Vanderpool, who set this system up, used a Vanderpool motor. He quickly gets rid of that troller and puts a pole on. They said that the board of Suburban wanted that troller. The oft-seen picture down below for a much more famous person, Frank Julian Sprague, he's also figured out by now how to take the motor, which is up in front of that streetcar on the top, put it underneath the car. Okay, so motors have moved underneath. He's developed a better pole, I'm sure, than Vanderpool had. His motors are, falling apart though, and they keep getting sent back to Thomas Edison, who will rebuild them, make them better, and of course, Edison will take a lot of credit for that system. Okay, well, you've got 6 years now after Philadelphia Traction. Not much has happened until 1890 and 91. He grabs 2 major lines, both in South Philly, Catherine and Bainbridge line, and the Philadelphia and Grays Ferry Company. And we will hear something more about the first operation. And it's first what cars look like. We all know that, but if I was giving a show to the senior citizens at a college, they might go, "Oh, how small." He continues to combine things. It's 1892, and he grabs both the Ridge Avenue line and the line running up and down 13th and 15th Streets. So that by 1893, he's got over 200 miles of track. This is 1905, and this is on Market Street at 8th. Now, Catherine and Bainbridge was, in 1892, the very first electric line in Philadelphia. Pittsburgh had electric streetcars in 1890, I think, because Widener had been burned in cable traction. He was a little bit skeptical and waited to see what was developing in this electric world. Now, there are letters I looked at in the Philadelphia archives, and people just didn't want to substitute horse cars. They were afraid of this, and but this was also a city where people were spent 5 years fighting against hydro water. So, okay, electricity is successful. This spurs the formation of two additional traction motor companies. One was electric traction, and that's really a loose combination of passenger railway companies in Northeast Philly, and some of the lines that run north and south east of Broad Street. And it's a huge system, and they have limited financial resources. So it's not at all a strong one. The really strong one here at this point was Peoples. And Peoples was a very small system, maybe 70, 75 miles long. However, it's grabbed the major lines early. It's got Germantown Avenue running north and south. It has the Girard Avenue line from end to end. It operates Old York Road up to Willow Grove, and in fact, it will control and own Old York Road. Very highly efficient management, and not very conservative, not nearly as conservative as Philadelphia Traction. Well, what happens in 1895? There's Widener and Elkins and Kemmel again, using their influence in the assembly. You can't influence the assembly, right, in Pennsylvania. They want to clarify the Act of 1887. And I put a lot of this down because I need to find a way to remember it. So we'll look west on Market Street, 1907. But if you want to read some of that, or I don't know if you want me to do it, but it allows traction companies to enter into contracts with each other. You could sell, lease, or operate any of the respective properties or franchises. Okay. Then it allows passenger railway companies to sell or lease all or part of the property or franchises to the traction motor companies. And it allows them to make the contracts with these traction companies for the operation of their line. And they did this because, this was already going on. And people wondered whether it was legal. And they wanted to make it very legal. They erased all doubts that what they had already done was now legal. And then, of course, down the bottom of the third act, it authorized traction or railway companies owning, leasing, controlling, or operating different lines to operate the lines as one complete system and lay out new routes over any of the streets occupied. So with this, basically all thoughts of competition, company versus company that the legislature had originally was gone. We think this is Girard Avenue. It's a PRT photograph in the archives of Pennsylvania Trolley Museum. And it's still not legal to come up with a new company. And everybody's leased so many of other companies that they continue to grow by doing that. Of course, the pyramid's getting taller. Each level has guaranteed dividends to a company below them. And you'll get to 1895 where there is one separate independent company left. This picture is about 10 years later, about 1909. So here's what it looks like. And I don't expect you to read this, but what happened was both Electric and Peoples were very concerned because of the size and the power of Philadelphia Traction. So they force it into a combination, another motor company called Union Traction, which is now sitting on top of the pyramid, comes up with $30 million in stock. And I got a book about this, and I can't wrap my head around some of this. How do you have a stock that originally sold for $11.30, sell for 76? And of course, all the railways on the bottom hold perpetual rights. They're in a position to say, this is what I want. I got franchise rights. This is what I want to do that. So all the carrying charges of these underlying companies are carried by Union Traction. Okay. They promise the dividends. Union Philadelphia Traction owners are supposed to get 8%. Nobody really gets anything in the short existence of this company. And that's just a map showing the area. Covered West Philly is now getting lines. There's more development up here. North Philly with the line going up to Willow Grove. If you guys can see my cursor, I hope. And of course, quite a bit going on here in South Philly, east of Broad Street. So there's still more development that needs to take place. And this map, I think, is 1895. And these franchises, continue to get more and more valuable. The city grows, and the franchise rights can extract a lot of money from these companies. So that annual guaranteed payment gets bigger. And each time there's a layer being piled on, a new company shows up, that the leases are going to get bigger. The company is paying about 1895 or so, 60% of its gross. In addition, it pays taxes. This is over along Ridge Avenue, and this beautiful building is still there. SEPTA several years ago reconstructed and rehabilitated it. It's 1896, where we have 400 miles of electrified track in Philadelphia. And by 1904, that's going to go up to about 540, 545 miles of track. We're looking around along Holyoke Road. It's June of 1896, where the company took in 10,210,000 and change. Fixed charges, all the rentals of the roads, the interest on the indebtedness, 5,463,051. And then there's almost $1 million in taxes. So, if you look at the company's report, it again leaves only 40% for maintenance, for wages, and above all, for new equipment. Here's the independent company that was left, and it was the Hessenville Mantua in Fairmont. It was largely under Jewish control. It ran Lancaster Avenue and then entered on 3 streets, Arch Street, Vine, and Race. 24-mile line, and it remained independent, but the recession of 1897, or a panic is what they would have used, forced it into union traction a year later. Now we have no independent operation. The track in front is Ridge Avenue. I'm not quite sure what the location of the car that's on it is. I'm not sure. Would anybody conceive that there's graft and political deals in Philadelphia? Right? Maybe some of you live there. Maybe you agree. There's a lot of graft, and a lot of it took the form of watered stock. And Pittsburgh also was part of this. Amazingly, Widener and Elkins were out here too, of overvaluing a stock, and the investors paid in more than the assets were worth. This is up in Northeast Philadelphia and Thompson Street. It's up in Bridgesburg, Thompson and Bridge, actually. And no public trust, just like we seem to have in our institutions now. There's no public trust in the traction company. The management, the stockholders, they were all insiders. People believe the politicians were in on this. And the term was used a lot in the newspaper, unholy profits. And they were mad because the company wasn't paying anything to the city for the use of the streets. And then people did consider that a very valuable asset. Now, here's a Philadelphia Citizen, 1896, January, and it's writing that the gas ring, it's another program entirely, the Philadelphia gas ring. Well, the chief figure in the gas ring was, in 1894, not only a director of Philadelphia Traction, but he was also a director in 6 of the roads operated by it. And so he's paying himself, gosh knows how many times. There's another prominent politician, also a director of a traction company and a director of 4 of the lines operated by it. So, but this was perfectly legal. You could be a political figure, even in state level, and be a director or an owner of a traction company. We're looking up the Schuylkill River, and that is northwest. That's Fairmount Park. There's Gerard Avenue down on the bottom. And Philly, is one of the 4 systems that would have a subway system, and it was the last to get it. And people wanted it, and there was an awful lot of fighting over where it was going to go. who's going to pay for it? Um, Certainly people did not want it over Market Street. This is Market Street during subway construction, about 1907, and nobody wanted an elevated rumbling over this. On the other hand, nobody knew what the heck was below the streets. There had never been any mapping of gas lines, water lines, sewer lines, cemeteries, and to this day, people still find things underneath as they're maybe ripping a building down. It's, oh, look at all these people buried here. And so this was a real concern. Nobody could find the money. So Union Traction said, the heck with it. We got streetcar lines and we're making some money, and let's just run the trolley lines. And here we are, Market at 13th Street. It's the winter of 1898. That's actually snow, something we don't see anymore. This is, believe, Market and 8th. And things are coming to a head now because it's 1902. It's congested as heck. And look at that. The figures I found in a document where between 5 and 6 at this intersection, 391 cars ran up and down, or east and west on Market Street. 126 eastbound, 166 westbound. And almost 100 cars were going north on the one-way street, 8th Street. So you got roughly a car every 10 seconds here. That must have been, and then forget the wagons, the pedestrians. I know I could not find pictures to support this, but it's 1901. And Matthew Stanley Quay is a state senator from out here in Western Pennsylvania, from Beaver County. He is the state's Republican boss as well. And he pushes these two bills that were aimed really at Widener and Elkins, who he had now become enemies with. And he aimed them at the Philadelphia franchise rights, the company's rights. And it provided for new underground and elevated railway companies and new surface lines. And it also said, well, the companies can use the tracks that are already there. Sounds like cable companies fighting over who uses the existing wires. So this was not an unusual thing. They violated all the rules in the legislature. They rammed it through. They forced the governor to sign it. And then in Philadelphia, the city councils, there were two at that time, and the mayor just arbitrarily granted these franchises. So somebody's hand was being twisted, or arm. The 13 companies included 5 elevated lines, a subway line, and 7 rapid transit lines. They really were surface operations. Almost 300 miles of track, though, to occupy almost every street in Philadelphia. And of course, if you've been traveling in Philadelphia, as I said here, some of them you can barely pass a car, an automobile, or a trolley. Now, all these incorporators are the same. Every company has the same incorporators, including Clarence Wolfe, who will wind up working with Philadelphia Rapid Transit, John and Joseph Mack, Michael Murphy, who's very unknown, but this would become known as the Mack Combine. And what it did was destroy the credit rating of Union. Who's going to invest in a traction company that's not making that much money when now you have all this competition? And they went to court to fight it, and the court said, oh, this is legal, And so finally, Union had to form Philadelphia Rapid Transit in 1902. What it did was acquire all these franchises, and it acquired at least Union Traction Company as well. The rental would start at 2%, was supposed to go to 6% over about 6 years. So they got rid of their competition by buying it up, and they added more layers of water, of course, to the organization. The only one of the elevated subway companies to be built would be the Market and Market Street subway. This is 1904. And it's really just starting construction around 46th Street. And they're supposed to get it done by 1906, and it doesn't happen. And they want more time, so the councils say, give us all the other franchises except for Frank Friedel, and you could have more time. So for the 1907 extension, they got the Broad Street franchise, which hadn't been taken at that point. This map, a lot of you guys probably, used to seeing Philadelphia Traction or Philadelphia Rapid or Philadelphia Transit track map. But the important thing was the line was being built out Market Street. And look up above. Look at how the streets are going up at an angle northwest on Lancaster, down into Southwest Philly, which is beginning to build down here. Well, how are these people supposed to get to the subway? And so they designed a 4-track subway that would accommodate not only 2 actual heavy subway tracks or heavy rapid subway tracks, but the West Philadelphia streetcar operations as well. And they actually run streetcars before they run the elevated service. And this is December of 1905. And they have to go in and they have a stub in terminal, and you have to, they have to actually put poles on what is generally a single pole fleet, because there's no way to walk the pole around down here beneath Market Streets. And they'll have different streetcar lines running in different types of service. The actual elevated or subway elevated won't begin running until March 23rd, 1907. And here's an off-use photograph on the bridge over the Schuylkill River. March 4th, 1907, they're going to begin operation. And they find out they don't have enough cars. They've got to order 40 more subway cars very quickly. I think initially they're only 2-car trains. Now, that's the High Line, I believe, down below. It might be, but, we think this is Grace Ferry Avenue. We're not sure. But if you take a look at that car, you realize that it's not it's a pretty sad car. And you realize these 3 fleets that were contributed to become the system's main fleet were all or almost all the original equipment. Some was in good condition. People's generally kept their fleet in very good condition, and electric traction stuff was in terrible shape. And here's the company in 1899 takes in almost 12 million, $11,794,000 in gross receipts. They pay out in fixed charges $5,635,000. So I don't think that buying new cars was important. We're down at 8th and Market, though, and you can take a look at the obsolete fleet. It's an obsolete open car. Ridership is going up. It goes up in 3 years, 17%. And how many cars did he get to buy? Well, 50, roughly 24-foot cars. So his 3rd at Market. He's going north. Typical rush hour. Now we're across the river, but 30th and Market Streets. They don't have any money to buy any cars. So now by 1901, just a few short years later, traffic's gone up 37%. They've only increased the car fleet by 5%. And these cars were the Philadelphia standard cars, and they were a whopping 28-foot long, little 4 or 5 foot longer than the standard 4-wheel cars. It was just a very insufficient fleet. And it was pretty much intact. And I got this from Harold Cox's book, but I found it quite interesting. They had acquired cars, obviously, since the electric inception in 1892, and it had acquired 2,686 cars. Of that fleet, 2,548 were still on the property, including cars that had become utility cars or work cars. That's the standard car. One, I think, is left right now up in Scranton. They had bought 772 of these cars. Locust turning north on the 9th. And what starts to happen in other cities, a little more progressive, is the pay as you enter car shows up. And I believe Montreal and Chicago both had these. And the newspapers were always heckling the company, began to heckle the company about why don't you get these big cars? And of course, one of the features of these big cars was a big platform. And take a look at the largest cars the company had, and it's not a very big platform. Okay. Also, they couldn't find money to buy a brand new fleet of cars. So, what can we do? Let's see what we can do to the platforms to make it work. And this is 1700. It's the very first car that's going to have a change in platforms. And this is a very good view. PRT took this, but you can take a look at the folding steps were put on the car. Dr. Cox, Harold Cox, thought these might have been the first use of a folding step on a streetcar anywhere at all. The conductor was removed from the platform to just inside the car. And he had a little tiny station. You can see that pole up and down. Um, he was able to control the doors from there, and he was able to make change and issue transfers. And it basically got him off the platform. And now this smaller platform was an area at least to hold the unpaid passengers while they were trying to get on and pay their fares. And it essentially speeded up some of the operations without going into a new car fleet. And the car fleet was really horrendous. Here's a local newspaper published by the German American League, and it called the conditions on the cars inhumane and beastly. None of these cars had very good ventilation. Um, they didn't have very much lighting and hardly any heat on these cars. And you can see they're very overcrowded. Here's the interior of standard Philadelphia cars. They were not comfortable seats. We have these at the Trolley Museum. I can attest to that. And also, people never liked to stare at one another, even 100 years ago, 100 plus years ago. And that's what you had to do. They wouldn't start putting heat on until 1907. What they did in the early days was put enough straw that covered your knees. And then what you did is people got on with their wet boots, it just made that straw a mess. And it was just a filthy inside. And you still weren't. This cartoon Harold Cox used, it's from one of the local newspapers. And it's a joke about the heat. They're really criticizing the cars, which are inhumanely unheated. And the board in 1903 comes up with the idea that, yes, we will heat these cars. Okay. And then they find out, yeah, but we don't have enough power to heat the cars and run the cars at the same time. And they're buying double truck cars, which of course is also increasing the use of the power that they had. And so we got to put in more power, so we can actually run and heat the cars. And they tell people that they're doing it, but it does take a little while. Westinghouse is not a help. Its workers are on strike. And so by December of 04, when President Parsons decides to experiment with the heat, only 400 to 500 cars of roughly 1,600 had heat on the cars. And he says, turn them on. And what happened was during the rush hour, they had to turn them off. From 5 to 7, the cars could be heated, and you couldn't, and whatever heat was on there was only 34 to 41 degrees anyway. Obviously, the unheated cars were much colder, but you couldn't run these cars and heat them at the same time. This is the old ferry terminal down at the foot of Market Street, the Delaware Avenue Expressway down here again. So it's July of 05, and 6 months later, Parsons promising that, yes, this year they'll all get heated. And that didn't happen until 1906. At that point, they had upgraded the power facilities enough to run the cars and heat the cars as long as nothing went wrong. So that here's the Delaware, I believe, Beach Street. This is one of the two stations they had, and this is Beach Street, which had this third wheel powered crane at. And the station went down, and for 2 days they turned all the heaters off, and they took cars off of each line so they can continue with some service. That's the Reading terminal in the background. So we know we're on Arch Street. So the cars were never well heated, even in good times. And of course, they didn't have much heat on them. It was a 18 to 24 footer, had four heaters, and I believe the 28 footers, the standard cars had six. The near sides are going to show up in 1912. They're going to have 24. So a big difference. There was hardly any heat on these cars at all. They were overcrowded all the time. These two crewmen don't even look like they're trying to collect the fare. No aisles in these cars, everybody hanging off. And it was impossible. And of course, the newspapers hit the company with the overcrowding issue as well, and that they weren't buying larger cars, that they were basically very cheap. Miserable for the operator, of course, because a lot of these cars didn't even have a windshield in front. So the people had some heat in the body of the car. This guy looked like he was very cold. Also, the shifts were long, sometimes up to 16 hours during a day, and the operator would have to stand. And, operators still complain today about not being able to see their kids because of the working hours. Although the length today of a transit worker is roughly 8 or 9. So they would eventually put windshields up on some of these cars, and crews had blankets all around their waist and extra blankets around heavy coat. And under the uniform, they wore this. And yep, that's a bag for operators who just couldn't get off the car. There were either no facilities along the line or at the end of the line, or you had no time. I mean, layovers, this is before unions, layovers were not built into the schedule. And this is known as the motorman's friend. And you took it home, and I'm sure the wife had watched this with everything else, and maybe she wasn't too happy about this. Here's a gang of people that I wouldn't want to get into a fight with. And you look at the newspapers, and there are fights on the cars over fares, and drunks get on and they're thrown off, and they even fight with off duty police officers who demand a free ride. It's a tough bunch. Working in these conditions, I can only see why. I always loved this photo. First saw it in Harold Cox's book. But well, the Phillies, I believe, are playing Pittsburgh. It's May 22nd, 1896, and people are all over Market Street, and they're in the middle of that very narrow devil strip. And it just illustrates the point of cars, streetcars trying to maneuver with pedestrians walking all over, and horses and wagons everywhere. It was just a very, nervous time for crews. When you were out there, you couldn't keep schedule with this going on. And it's pretty evident that the wheels fit perfectly on the 5 foot 2.25 inch rails, and this rail gauge was mandated by the city. You can see why. And Sears, if you look at Sears catalogs, you'll see they sold a variety of axle widths, and apparently this was a common width in Philadelphia. This is 1909. And then you have this up on the upper left. You have delivery wagons, and of course, coal was being used, probably anthracite from where I was born, being delivered. And this is going to create traffic jams as well. Now we'll find out later. The company ran its own coal cars, and that creates a problem as well. Obviously, this car is not going to creep by that wagon down on the lower right. Fires, wooden buildings everywhere, colonial buildings all over the place, and fires were probably much more common than they were today. And the industry would develop these things called hose jumpers. You can clamp to the track, run the hoses through, and at least wherever you could, try to maintain the service. Here's the demonstration of all the hoses. 1712 is running over the hose jumper in an unknown car house. Ah, doesn't that look scary? And the newspapers are full of people getting run over, particularly little children. When the horse cars were running, it wasn't a big deal. They were slow, and everybody, of course, back in these days, conducted business out in the street. They were out talking. The children played. I mean, the streets were just a common ground, but you didn't have too many accidents until these things showed up. And the electric car is heavier and it's faster, and traffic is getting heavier. So, more people are now falling in front of the cars. What did they do? Well, there's that uh, fender, if you want to call it that, and it's just pipe bent, and rope netting is installed on that. We're on Market Street around 12th here, and there was a good view, a side view of that. Um, Philadelphia safety fender, and of course, people denounced this, and a whole bunch of people came up with new ideas at some point. And these things, I mean, they were always hitting obstructions on the ground. They were never high enough. That doesn't look high enough for somebody to clear and be caught by the fender. The fender itself, if you look on the upper right, the rope was always rotting. Maintenance wasn't very good. So it wasn't very effective. Um, the universal lifeguard would be unveiled about 1911. And that's what you see today on a lot of cars. I guess the K cars have them, where that swinging gate, if I fall and I hit it, it goes back up and it drops a basket. It forces a basket to drop, and it'll roughly roll me around, but I'll be kept away from the wheels. And this is where everybody didn't like it. And 300, there was a committee out there denouncing it, and 300 people submitted different unworkable solutions. And in the end, they finally said, this is what we're going to use. And that was PRT's choice in the beginning. So here are some demonstrations of the lifeguards. The nearsides have arrived. Of course, on the bottom, you can see the basket that's going to be dropped whenever that wooden the front is pushed. Now, trolley ropes. If you look at this car, the thing that really stands out is that there is no catcher or retriever, whatever they use. I suspect catchers are common in Philadelphia. And they tied the rope to one of the windows, or they just let it drag. And dragging ropes became a source of injury for a lot of people. They tripped over them getting on and off the car, or it just caught them as they were walking on the street. It was another source. This, of course, source of accidents, overloading. This, I'm sure, is posed, but it shows all the kids trying to steal a ride. They do that with bicycles as well, and of course, the newspapers are full of this. Kids are killed all the time by streetcars. This trolley company is denounced. There's the kid riding with his bike, getting a free ride. So these are all the dangers that, and they try to show the operators what to watch for out here. Now, parks. We all know Willow Grove Park. This was Chestnut Hill Park. It was Erdenheim. It was just outside the Philadelphia boundaries, up along Germantown Avenue. And it was established in 1898 by the Chestnut Hill Casino Company. They bought land up in Springfield Township, near Bethlehem Pike and Paper Mill Road, and they had developed a park within 3 months. And of course, the trolleys went and served it. Working class people went up into Chestnut Hill. Middle class people did that. It came down from the Lehigh Valley Transit, which also served this facility, and PRT. And it was very popular. One thing, PRT only charged a nickel to get there. A long ride up to Willow Grove Park was 30 cents. It's a lot of money back then. And the waiting room is here. There's the carousel. There would be a freight terminal established up here. And they had a lake. They had a roller coaster, as you can see. We know they had the carousel. There was a casino, and it was very lovely lands. It was a very lovely landscape here. Plants, trees. People love this when you live down in the row house environment of Lower Philadelphia. You could ride a boat on this, and they even had pony rides. So 1906, the park was rebuilt. They redecorated it, and at that time, they renamed it White City. Now, people in Chestnut Hill, they were always upper class. They didn't want these people here at all. So what they did in 1912, some of the wealthier ones um, bought the park for 500,000. They shut it down. They demolished it. And today there's a park, I think, called Cisco Park, and the small pond is part of the lake, is all that remains of that park. Another much longer lived park, People's Traction's trolley line to Willow Grove. Well, that opened up in 1895, Memorial Day, and 10,000 people go up to this park, and all they find is the Mineral Springs Hotel. And Charles Ehrenfort, who has purchased that inn in 1890 and renamed it, he's selling ice cream, he's selling popcorn, popcorn cakes, he's selling lemonade, and the people have nothing else to do up there. There is a carousel on his grounds and a lot of picnics. So this guy's making money, and it catches the eye of the traction company. They go across the street and buy 2 farms. They buy 90 acres and they build what would become Willow Grove Park. And that opens in 1896. They carry 1 million people up Old York Road to the park in the first season. And this park would remain open until 1958. It was at one time one of the premier amusement parks, and it would basically be eclipsed by parks like Disneyland, bigger modern theme parks that showed up in the 50s. And the park would close after operating under various owners. The streetcar company would have already sold it. But, there's your slogan, life is a lark, at Willow Grove Park. And it was a beautiful park. I remember being at Willow Grove Park, and they had a uniformed guards there to keep everybody in order. There was no alcohol allowed. There were over 100 rides and various attractions. You can see 2 of them there. That hill, Mountain Railway, that's a roller coaster, and you can see the swings over there on the left. Concerts were a big thing here, and they had this huge band shell. It could accommodate a shelter, accommodated 4,000, but the ground sloped and down to it, and up to 25,000 people were known to stand and listen. And they had free concerts every week, and big named orchestras like John Philip Sousa played here, every year, except there were 2 years he didn't. 1901 was one, and I believe 25 or 26. Okay. Willow Grove opens, and then a little bit farther north in Bucks County, yeah, Doylestown. Well, we want to get down there too. So Bucks County Railway is organized up there, and it takes them 4 years before they can open up a 12-mile line from Doylestown down to Willow Grove. And that happens on May 28th of 1898. And the ride is going to take 45 minutes to do 12 miles. And that sounds like Pittsburgh driving here today. Here's Willow Grove. It was a toll road, as I told you before. So the trolleys were up here running free, but people would have to pay their tolls. Open cars, of course, in the summer were very popular. And eventually the toll roads were all bought up, I believe, in the 20s by the state highway department. Now, Route 6, which ran a lot longer than Route 55, that becomes the shorter line that's built through Glenside because Old York Road was just such a bottleneck. That line was constructed in 1903, and to accommodate several lines that are here now, they build this big terminal. It opens up in 1905, and it's set up, to handle crowds. One platform on the crowds unloading, the other one is for trolleys loading. There's a yard there. You'll see a loop over to the right. Just off the picture is the Willow Grove Car House. Here's 8042, which turns out to be the last car running on the last day on Route 55, because the state wants to widen this road. It's only 2 lanes. Let's take the trolley right away, and we're going to fix all this. And so the trolley disappears from Willow Grove via Old York Road. Now here's the Glenside line. We're actually here at the 3 truck section, just coming out of the park. But this would run on private right away to the park until I think 1957, 58, 58. It had three closure dates, and this was closing because that right of way was going to be acquired by the state for Route 309, among other things. And but it would take three different attempts to close this line, and it was a lot of private way on it. There's the PRT band, and it's standing, of course, at the Art Museum. Rocky's not there yet, and it had 256 people. There were four bands in this musical group, and there was, of course, the major band, the big band. They played at all the pageants. They would play the Mummers Day parade, and they actually produced two records. One was the March of the Minutemen, which was written by John Philip Sousa. Then on the upper left on the steps, was the Harmonica Band, and that was a relatively new group formed in 1927. And the Kilties, of course, were there on the upper right, and they were the Scottish band. In the middle, upper middle, behind the big band, was known as the Merrymakers, and they were the all-black band. This was, of course, a time of segregation, so the band, they were allowed to be band members, but they weren't allowed to mix in, and certainly were not part of the major band that played at Willow Grove Park. The big band, here it is, 133, about half of the men that were in the band, and they won a prize in 1926 at the sesquicentennial. Of course, like so many of these companies, they had baseball teams, they had bowling teams, they had tennis teams, and baseball was very popular. If you were at the neighborhood car house, everybody, your family was there. You probably lived in the neighborhood, and you were playing another company, another car barn, perhaps, maybe the company maintenance people, maybe another company. But these games were very, very popular, and even schedules, as you can see, were published. One craze, this actually happened in Scranton for a year too, way up there. And Cox covers this in several books very well. And this was August and September, late summer of 1895. The company constructs party cars, and they're open cars, and they're covered with lights. They're just festooned with hundreds of lights. And they roam the streets. You can charter these cars. There's a monitor with 865 lights. And they had 28 other decorated cars. And people would get on that first year, and they were allowed to bring musical instruments like trumpets, and bagpipes. And there was drinking, and they ran late into the night, and people were not, the neighbors at least, were not very happy. And that's one of the party cars there. And they would just run another year in 1896 because the city had banned liquor on these cars. They banned fireworks. They limited the singing and instruments. So you couldn't do that after 11 when things were just getting exciting, and you couldn't make any noise at all whenever you were by a hospital. Of course, they made money using, carrying U.S. mail. 1895, Peoples got into a contract with the post office. They ran it from Chestnut Hill down Germantown Avenue to South Philadelphia. And of course, they owned that line. And they had regular service beginning in June of 1895, and they delivered to the stations. They actually broke mail down at some point on the cars. There's a slot to the right of that circle, and people are surprised when I tell them you can mail the letter. And they ran 8 trips a day on this line. Here we are downtown around Market and 9th. That's where the post office was downtown. It was very successful. And eventually there would be 6 railway post office routes operating. And of course, the company made money on this. There's the interior of it. So you could actually work letters on these cars in addition to carrying a bulk mail in sacks. And mail cars could be anything. We saw that small mail car earlier. They would build about 1912, 1911. They would build bigger cars. But by 1915, 4 years later, PRT needs money, and they're going to ask for more. And the mail service, they're in a crisis as well. So they moved to their mail service to trucks, and the last mail is carried by PRT, November 14th, 1915. Some of these cars are going to be used for other purposes. Now, in the state, don't ask me how this got past the state's 51st senator, which is the Pennsylvania Railroad. In 1907, the legislature voted to allow the trolleys, the various companies, to carry freight. PRR didn't want to see this. And PRT got into the freight business in 1908 in May, and they carry milk. That's their first freight car. 12 cents per 30-quart can. And the first trip only carried 50 cans. And their first terminal was at 15th and Huntington, which is North Philly. That's typical freight station. We're on a Doylestown line between Willow Grove and Doylestown. And this is 1909 when they're building these small freight stations. Cars, you can see the freight car would probably just stop and do its business. And if there was a passenger car behind it, I guess too bad for the people in the car. I love this picture. Don't ask me where I got it. Sometimes you're just lucky. Now, in the beginning, a lot of farmers shipped their produce, shipped their milk down into Philly, and eventually it would become more the other way. And particularly after 1920, when the highways got better and farmers bought much better trucks than there had been in the pre-war period, they were bringing their stuff down to the various markets, farmers markets, many of which were not effectively served by the trolley company. What was going out, 90% of the business, was stuff coming out of department stores and other businesses like that, heading out, bringing freight out to the suburbs. This was a freight station that sat on top of the Market Street subway when it came out at Front Street. And I remember seeing that building there before I-95 went through there, and the tracks were still sitting in it long after the freight business had ended. You can see the freight cars sitting out there. Here's the freight interchange up at White City Park, or Chestnut Hill Park, however you want to call it, between the PRT and the Lehigh Valley. And that was a cross platform because of the gauge change, the standard gauge of the Lehigh Valley Transit. The broad gauge of PRT, you just couldn't run the car straight down on somebody else's tracks. You had to interchange at the freight station, or maybe across the cars. This was the downtown freight station at Front Street. There weren't many terminals downtown. In fact, I think this was the only one. And the farmers markets were really not served well. And Mitten was there, and he was an efficiency guy, and he realized he'd lose a lot of money serving these markets. I mean, he had freight going. His profits had gone to between 1911 and 1920, between 50,000 and over 253,000. And of course, doing it his way. By 1921, they had lost money, 30,000 or so. It was down to 232,000 and change. By 1922, a year later, profits had gone down to 67,000. So your handwriting was on the wall here. And then Thomas Mitten, and Merritt Taylor, who ran the Philadelphia and Westchester traction company, they interchanged freight at 63rd Street. There was a platform there, and these two got into a fight, probably not even over freight. But he canceled the interchange agreement in April of 21. Then he decided, hey, in October, we'll get rid of all the other interchanges. So that would be the Lehigh Valley, the Reading that came into White City as well. And then they carried their last milk on April 1st, 1922. But here was another way they made money. A lot of people wondered about this. And there's Clarence Wolfe. Remember him from the Mac Combine? This is 1906. He's running a financial house. He's an advisor to Mayor Rayburn. He's also a PRT director and a stockholder. And he now owns 80 acres of land near 9th and Torresdale Boulevard. And that's called Roosevelt Boulevard. And of course, this is not flat land suitable for building. He's got to find a way to fill it up. Okay. We got another guy, a local politician and would be Senator Edward Vare. He gets a contract for hauling ashes and rubbish from the Central District. He's taking it to South Philly, where he and his brother are building Broad Street, and they need fill. So 1907, these two city officials, a man named Benson and another named Stern, they're both former employees and probably friends of Clarence Wolfe. They pushed legislation through requiring rubbish and ashes to be hauled only by trolley to outlying dumps. And that gets PRT in the rubber or the rubbish business. And you can imagine what dump they're going to go. You know, Vare is going to pay, almost $11,000 per month for hauling. He pays $5,500, which is half the cost per car for building these cars. And yep, they just happen to be up at the Wolfe Brothers land. And, you know, according to the Philadelphia Record, the dump catches fire frequently. The fire department goes up, they hose it down, and they compact the fill. So, you know, people are going to wonder about this deal. It's an interesting picture at the Kelowna Streetcar on Kelowna Street. So that's near the car house. They build 8 of these. They use 7 in regular service. One's the spare, because there's always probably one that needs some kind of maintenance. The earliest doors are going to be hinged at the top. They'll swing open. Later, doors will swing sideways, and they'll be held by bars, which didn't always hold it. The floors are a little bit higher on the inside, so allegedly the garbage is supposed to flow out. The pressure on the doors did of course, cause them to open up when they weren't supposed to, and many a pedestrian or wagoner got doused with some of this rubbish. Here's the upper floor of the rubbish station, and this is District 2 hauling. They begin District 3 in 1909. So they're picking up a lot of garbage. They run them up these ramps. The horses pull them up, and they dump them into the cars. There's a chute below to do that. And then there's tracks, portable tracks and wiring, overhead wiring that can be moved around while the cars are dumping. And these look like really happy fellows doing this job. And as Dr. Cox noted, when I visited him one time, we were looking at pictures and he had brought all these out. He said, look how they handled the clearance problem coming out of that building, the rubbish building, and negotiating a very tight turn onto a single track street. They traveled in pairs, first during the day, beginning about 7:30. And they were out there 8 to 12 hours a day. So they made a number of trips, and they tied up rush hour traffic. And then when they started running them at nights, these monsters just, rumbling down the canyons of city streets, and of course, dumping debris in their wake. So they would end the refuse hauling in 1912, revive it again in a new area in 1917. They were dumping it down in South Philly, down at League Island, filling that. And then in the end, they got rid of most of those cars. This car was a former refuse car, and it became a flat with 2 cabs, and it was being used in this picture, I believe, to build Callow Hill Depot in West Philly. They made some money in the funeral business, and this car was built for the company Hillside Cemetery, which was up on the Willow Grove line, wanted the funeral car, and they guaranteed a minimum return of $2,500 and for 7 years. And they built this car for $4,300. They carried their first casket August 17th, 1912, and this car would operate until August of 1930. And the cemetery never had to make up a deficit. The business was ongoing, as you can imagine, and funerals were not that expensive. In fact, it's assumed that almost every cemetery in the city would use this car at one point or another. And it was available as long as the Hillside Cemetery wasn't conducting their own funeral. So um, you'll see where the casket is there. There's the inside. So right up here in front is where the casket and the pallbearers would sit. That's on the left on the upper, or I'm sorry, on the right. On the upper left was where the mourners sat. Down below was the crew. And the crew didn't wear their usual uniforms. They dressed in black. And if they had to be pallbearers, they had their own skull caps to wear. Labor issues were usually, and there was an 1888 strike, which really was their first big labor issue. The men wanted it just a 12-hour day. Just imagine a 12-hour day. They were working a lot more hours, pay, and they wanted union recognition, as so many of our industries in this country now demand it. Okay, there was a strike, began in May 1909. It was over those issues and the right to buy uniforms on the open market. Okay, the company wanted them to buy uniforms where they wanted them to do that, and they were expensive. And they also wanted management to recognize the Amalgamated Association of Streetcar Employees. And back in the day, these were fun. These incidents were fun to watch. In fact, back in the day, people participated in them rather frequently. There was rioting in the city. The residents joined in. And finally, they brought the violence to an end. A state senator, I believe James McNichol, and Mayor Rayburn urged the company to settle. And they reached an agreement on June 2nd, 1909. Or I'm sorry, June 2nd, 1909. And they got a wage increase from 21 to 22 cents an hour. I guess back in those days, that was a lot more money than we think of it now. The workday went down to 10 hours. So that was a big change from the 16 hours that originally had been going on in the horse car days, the early electric days. And then they could buy uniforms from 5 clothiers. And allegedly, the company would recognize the union, but they reneged on that. They tried to establish a replacement union. They didn't want to deal with the amalgamated, and jobs were given, promotions were given to certain members of the PRT union. So now we're leading into more trouble. And this looks like a lot of trouble. The company got rid of 173 motormen and conductors. And these were folks that had participated in this 2-month strike in 1910 or 1909. The struggle, it precipitated this, right? This was the longer strike. And it just went on with more violence. And of course, these people do not look like operators, do they? Like company employees. Now, the employees got the citizens on their side. And in fact, there were strikes in other industries as well as a way to support the PRT. And they burned streetcars. They actually ripped up rails. They assaulted the police. Who could think of doing that today, right? The state police, I believe, was called in to this. And the unions was a scorched earth policy here. Let's just, we're going to do everything to keep these cars from running. We're going to hurt the company. And it was in 2 months. Well, they finally brought in the National Guard and the state police, and they were to provide protection from any operators that were out there. And you can see they're mounted. But yes, people attacked the state police and their horses. But a lot of the other industries, the other city unions realized that with the National Guard here, we've just got to go back to normal life. And their support for the strike would fade away. But this was a huge financial loss. In fact, nobody knows what the loss was for PRT. What was the financial loss of this 2-month strike? There was a lot of bitterness that had divided the motormen and the conductors up. There was no morale. There was no money in the company. And the company went baying to a man named E.T. Stotesbury. And he was head of the firm Drexel Morgan and Company, and that was a major financial company. You know, he was like E.F. Hutton. He would say something, and other banks would join in. They asked that he join the PRT board of directors and bring in anybody else that he wanted to. They needed to sort out all the chaos. And Stotesbury would present a plan for refinancing. What he demanded was that he buy out Widener's interests, and put in an entirely new management, which did occur. And he brings in Thomas Mitten from Chicago City Railway. He was also managing director of that time of the International Railway of Buffalo, and he pretty much gave Mitten carte blanche. And Mitten looks around, and one of the first things he says is, "We've got 2,000 streetcars that are obsolete junk." So between 1911 and 13, he scraps most of them, and he replaces them with these beautiful Nearsides, only one of which exists today, I believe, up at Seashore. And the first go into service in October 1911 on Route 2. And these cars are going to run around, and they're going to watch them, and they're going to see what they need to change before they build the other cars. And people love them. They're spacious. They got heat. They have unbelievably bright lighting. And then one of the things that doesn't work is the ventilation. Notice the air scoops on the top of the car. Well, they were moved. Those scoops were originally down on the bottom of the car, and this is a time when the streets are dirty and horses are still doing their business down there. And I suspect the car didn't smell the best. The roof ventilators were better, but then cold air would come in, blowing wind comes in, and they make the cars a bit drafty on the inside. These were muzzle loaders. They loaded and unloaded from the front door. There was no center door. They would be converted, or many of them would be converted later. And originally they put the conductor next to the motorman. Then they move them, as you see in the bottom right, because they're talking. The crew talks too much. There's labor and morale issues, of course. And Mitten comes up with his cooperative plan, and he says, "I'll deal with the union directly," and he creates this base wage, 22% of gross receipts. And this is going to be the basis for future wage increases. So obviously, the more people you carry, the more money you make, and the higher your wage will be. And so the understanding is they'll share in any gains. Grievances would be held through committees. The committees from the different car houses are elected by the men. On Mitten, of course, was trying to keep out other unions while he was doing this. So he had an ulterior motive as well. The streetcars are still being held up by wagons. The children, remember all the kids we talked about, and look at the chaos around his school. No wonder kids are getting hurt. He establishes a safety patrol and a safety program. As you can see on the bottom, patrol guards is what we would call them in high school, the 1960s, out there to control the chaos of kids coming around school, going into school, going out of school. You ran pedestrians. Now, the Frankfurt Elevated is the first city transit undertaking. It's really undertaken by the city of Philadelphia, and it would link to the Market Street line in Front and Arch. It's going to run over Frankfurt Avenue and Kensington Avenue, and go up into Frankfurt at Bridge Street. And the elevator is being built, as you can see. There it is, new cars, additional cars. It opens on November 4th, 1922. It costs $15.5 million to build, and it is leased to PRT to operate it. That's a southbound train at Torresdale in 1922. Okay, there is housing being built north and northwest of the Frankfurt terminal. So they established a streetcar line to go up, and they buy 5 Barney cars to serve that area. And they can't carry enough people on these Barney cars. And what they have to do is substitute some of its larger 5200 cars. You see that one below on Cheltenham Avenue at Old York Road, to carry the loads. The Bernies will go down into the city and they'll wind up operating on various shuttle routes. This is Chestnut Street. We're looking west. They buy more cars, 385 cars that are single-ended, 135 that are double-ended, and probably one of the largest work car fleets of sweepers and cranes and dump cars ever been purchased. I think about 50 cars. They also have this showing up. This is somewhere in South Philly, obviously not in the most developed area, but it's 1923 and trackless is in its infancy. And this is Oregon Avenue, which is about 6 lanes, 5 or 6 lanes today. You can see the netting on both poles, protected from losing power on the tracks. But there's industries down here and they want to serve them. And then buses are going to show up, some of the first buses. And that's the spring of 1925. 200 buses are ordered, and they're single level and double decker. And they're running on Roosevelt Boulevard. Excuse me, they're running up in rural areas that really don't have enough population to support the capital expense of a streetcar operation. And there are places where residents don't want any tracks. And it's the end of 1926. And it's finally operating a fully rounded system of coordinated transportation. It's not a trolley company. You have 600 miles of streetcar track, yes, 39 miles of elevated and subway routes, 362 buses. They're now also operating not only city routes, but some intercity buses connecting with Philadelphia, with New York and Atlantic City and Baltimore and Washington. This is one of those. They formed the Philadelphia Rapid Transit, Rapid Transit, another PRT, in 1925, and they would operate this interurban bus service. Then the first operation was Philadelphia, New York, and then they went to Washington, and then they would cross the Delaware River Bridge, the Ben Franklin Bridge, to go to Atlantic City. And then Minton decided he wanted to control the cab companies as well. This was another source of revenue. They certainly conserve areas that public transportation did not. And so he by 1926 had gotten hold of all 4 of the city cab companies. 1,100 taxis were operated by PRT. Then there was this, the sesquicentennial showed up. Certainly not nearly the success of the regular centennial, our first 100 years. That, in fact, the bicentennial was a real mess. But Minton decided to inaugurate this airline, carry the mail and people from the sesquicentennial. It would only be during the sesquicentennial. It went from Philly to Washington. Later, it would go out to Norfolk. And I think they had 2 or 3 planes. And they would end this with the close of the centennial. It was a $15 fare in one direction, $25 round trip. And certainly was a bright spot at the sesquicentennial, but hey, it only made 42,200 fares. The mail only brought in 4,400, and they spent 169,000. So the fare payers basically chipped in $118,400 for this experimental airline. 26 was the beginning of bad times. The system would become more unstable as ridership shrunk, and Minton would have to start selling assets. So first thing he sold was the interstate bus company. That went to the Pennsylvania Railroad in 1928, although Minton management continued to operate. Philadelphia Rapid Transit Company was sold to the Public Service Coordinated Transport of New Jersey in 29. Now, the other thing was the city had always wanted to get control of the transit system, and they're going to start negotiations for the sale of that in 1927. Well, here's the Broad Street car. This Broad Street subway, a 4-track subway down to City Hall from Broad and Olney, opens on September 1st, 1928. 2 years later, in 1930, it would be extended to South Street, and all the way down, it would reach Snyder Avenue, all the way down in South Philly, September 18th, 1938. They would build a spur um, along Ridge Avenue, under Ridge Avenue. It was called the Ridge Avenue 8th Street Subway, and it would leave the main subway at Girard Avenue. And that stem, that little branch, was opened up December 21st, 1932. Broad Street line cost 118 million plus, and the spur cost a little over 11 million. 2 tracks below Center City. Now, uh, reports are being done on PRT's finances. And the McCord report, criticized this system of leases and the guaranteed dividends on top of guaranteed dividends. This is still going on. He called it the accumulation of fixed charges probably never paralleled in the history of street railway exploitation. He's probably right. By the 30s, then the PRT's finances with all of these leases were very convoluted. Nobody even knew how to determine the company's real value. Okay. You had a lot of heavy rentals being paid to the underliners. They went up through the 20s. So now the company was paying over $8 million just to the original companies. And of course, the stockholders who own the original companies were long since dead. They weren't making any of the money at all. The city did 2 or 3 studies, and it recommended that all the underliers be condemned and the city acquire the transit properties. They thought it was $135 million. And they begin a suit now against Mitten and the PRT. There's Mitten Management, which is running PRT, and they're charging that management company with excessive fees, that funds were being diverted. They wanted an independent audit. And before that happened, Mitten had gone to the Poconos in October 1st, 1929. They find him floating in a lake near his summer home. Nobody ever really knows what happens. Did somebody push him? Did he commit suicide? Did he just fall in and have a heavy coat on? It was a cold day. In any case, Mitten's now out of the picture, and PRT gets trustees in 1931. The contract with Mitten Management is canceled, so the city saves $3 million. And there was a Mitten building that was canceled, and Mitten Bank Securities was involved too. The company had filed for bankruptcy on October 1st in 1934, and it operates, of course, under Section 77B while it tries to reorganize. Well, 34 is another big try. The city now goes after the underliers, and they want to get rid of these rental payments. And it's really nasty. And of course, the underliers are talking about perpetual this and perpetual that franchises, and you can't do this. Well, apparently they continued to do it, and it spills into federal court in 1935, and it goes on for another 4 years. This contest, the underliers finally came up with a price, and they were bought out. The company was reorganized, and they appear in January of 40 as Philadelphia Transportation Company. And they buy new cars. 38, they bought new PCCs. There's new buses coming. There's new trackless trolleys coming. That's probably me saying, Daddy, I want to go on a streetcar. I won't tell you what my daddy's going to say. But this really, starts to invest. They have new money, of course, out of the reorganization. So they buy 130 new streamlined PCCs. They buy 50 trackless trolleys, 53 brand new buses. They begin to overhaul some of the older trolley fleet. So 5200 series, 8,000 cars are going to get nicer seating, nicer painting, better heating. They're not going to concentrate on the rapid transit lines as much as the surface line. And one of the things that goes away very quickly is Ridge Avenue, which of course would have never been able to operate PCCs. I don't think the power was very good on this. The clearance was horrible, sometimes 4.5 inches between cars. And I wonder if these guys are out here talking about, who scraped who on Ridge Avenue here. And this is going to be replaced by paving and trolley buses. And of course, the traffic's getting heavier on Ridge Avenue. Streetcars are being delayed. And the trolley buses, as you can see, can swing right around everything. So you got delivery trucks parked here. Nope, won't bother me. I'm going around. Here is Broad Street. I think that's City Hall over in the back. Right. And, despite all the efforts of PTC, you can see what's dominating the scene here. There's double deck bus, of course, here, and a newer bus. Cars are sitting around in the car house because they had obviously laid people off, cut service, and they got rid of over 300 cars, mostly nearsides, and we're probably going to get rid of a few more. This is down in Southern. These are some of the older, I believe, Hog Island cars. 4,000 cars. Yeah, they're Hog Island cars, except, of course, this happens. And that is the Arizona going up. Somebody had not only filmed this picture, but there's a movie of this thing going up, and it is absolutely unbelievable to watch this thing. Over 1,000 sailors died on this. Probably a quarter of all the people died at Pearl Harbor, where casualties of Pearl Harbor were in this. But, of course, this starts a war, and this creates a need for mass transit, a need for all the equipment that's been sitting around, and the shops get back into the business of reconverting all those unused cars, and they bring in work cars that had been former passenger cars. They reconvert them back. They're doing 10 cars a week. And they're also doing heavy repairs on another 16 cars a week. Now, the Office of Defense Transportation gets involved. After World War I, the government held a lot of hearings because the government interference during the war had been chaotic. And they wanted to make sure they could do it right if we ever got into another conflict. So the Office of Defense Transportation, as you read from the title, was in charge of all transportation, and they took on mass transit, and they were diverting routes to send vehicles where they were needed to different plants. In some cities, including Philadelphia, they said, you know what, you're not running streetcars here anymore, but you got the tracks and you got the wire. Put the trolleys back. And Route 73, which had not been a rail operation for a while, went back to being a rail operation. They established new routes. So here's the 79 slash, and they used 2-car trains. They connected the Navy Yard and the Quartermaster Depot because Philadelphia had quite a few various different military installations. The company tried this, the victory seats, and these people look so happy on the left, but they don't look very comfortable on the right. This was car 7056, and the idea was to get more capacity in the cars. And they said you braced your foot on a front bar mounted on a shelf, and you just grabbed a handful of rail mounted on the top, and you hung on. And people hated it. People got to know this car number, and they let it go by. So the car was taken and reconverted into, back into its original format. People would start to be drafted. Of course, many of the younger operators were being drafted. How do you connect these people that are now in far distant places with the company? Well, they established a magazine, Off Peak. And it was really all news of what the company did in some cases, but mostly who got married, who had a baby, who was where in the armed forces, who got a medal, what did the baseball teams do. And it was also a great way to sell bonds. And a great way to promote the blood drives. Now, by 1943, yeah, lots of young guys going in, and we need operators. And as the company would find out, please, I'm not trying to be offensive, they absolutely did not want to hire on the platform our black citizens. And they began in May of 43 to hire women. They advertise. This is ads in the little I can't think of the brochures that they put on. It's just it's what happens when you get old, and I'll remember it later. But these were all over the cars, and they would advertise for women, and they would get the same training as men, except Joe Bush had told me they had an extra day learning to drive a car, because it was assumed that most women in this period never drove a car at all, and that was an extra thing. Otherwise, they got the same training that their male counterparts did. So here's Dorothy Redden, and she was on 42, and we know 42 is a busy line. There are scenes from around the company. The system city was known as Workshop to the World, so it had 40 major industries like Baldwin. There were a lot of minor industries. There were 7 shipyards in the area. Then there was the Naval Yard, and then, of course, up north, the Frankfurt Arsenal. And so look at the crowds getting on Cramp Shipyard on Richmond Street. Up there is the Bud Company at the end of Route 56, Hunting Park in Venango, and there's Frankfurt Arsenal with a ton of people getting on the Route 15 cars. There's a typical safety island. There's no concrete protection at all, and but they're all trying to get on that car on Erie Avenue, so it would be a Route 56 car. And notice the black workers. The war allows blacks to really make strides in industry, in civilian industry employment, because there's a labor shortage, and the federal government is banning race-specific job listings. They won't certify a union that forbids any minority participation. And that doesn't, of course, apply to PTC. They're still very discriminatory. And nobody in that company, be it an operator, a conductor, or manager, really wants to see blacks on the platform, running cars, collecting fares. And there are protests for this, of course, going on. And they finally get pushed by the federal government to bring in and train black operators. And they go ahead and they take from their workforce of blacks who had basically been doing nasty jobs, dirty jobs. They put them on the in training. Okay. Meanwhile, in March of 44, the big year of the strike, PTC workers, they formed the Transit Workers Union as a bargaining agent over the old company, because Mitten, of course, had a company union. And there's the Federal Fair Employment Practice Committee getting involved to integrate the workers. And the PTC is saying, look, we don't have a contract right now. We're still negotiating. We don't want to do this right now. Well, that was too bad. And as I said, the federal government pushed them to say, abide by our policies, our employment policies. That discriminates, or that avoids discrimination. You're not supposed to do that. And they bring in 8 operators, and they start training them. And this is a famous newspaper. This is Thomas Allen, and he is one of the first of our black operators, and he's getting instruction the same as anybody else. Well, this is Luzerne. Notice nothing's running here. It's August 1st. It's Tuesday, 1944. And this is the day the black operators were turning in, and all the workers are getting sick. Oh, we got to leave. And then finally a committee comes up and says, yeah, well, it's really over the company's decision over black workers. And there's the PRT union president, Frank Carney, who's no longer an employee. And he says it right there. We won't go back to work until they take the Negroes off. So what do we have? Well, we have chaos. And they normally carried about 2.5 million people during the day to all these war jobs. And obviously the people are trying to get to work any which way. Newspapers love, of course, to get a bunch of pretty women in a picture, hitchhiking or showing their sore feet, or otherwise, riding dangerously on somebody's car. But production, war production goes down by 70% on the first day. And that is, of course, very serious to the government. And here are, more sensible scenes of how people are getting around. And that includes trucks, and that includes that poor woman down on the lower left coming off the ice cream truck. It must have been a kind of a cold day, but at least it was August. Well, the TWU really opposed the strike, but it hadn't really violated the Smith-Connolly Act. So it's saying you guys shouldn't strike. That's the Transit Workers Union. The issue is now going to Roosevelt. Roosevelt sends Major General Philip Hayes, and he comes up with his statement saying, you better go to work or you're going to face conscription. Don't forget, this is a war job, and you might be safe from the draft, okay? The Army then, seizes control of the system. They post their paper and saying this is now ours, and the newspapers got this breaking up strike. And the people are real happy in Philadelphia because there had been local rioting over this issue, and there had been rioting over this issue in other cities in the country. And now they feel very safe because, the Army's going to seize control. And the workers don't listen to Philip Hayes. They stay off. It's Saturday now. It's August 5th. And Hayes is just, I've had enough of this nonsense, because we're not making bullets and somebody's going to get killed. And so he tells the union that if you don't go to work on Monday, August 7th, you're going to lose your draft deferment. You're going to be blacklisted by the War Manpower Commission. Well, that means you won't get another job where you can really make money, and you couldn't get a job, a wartime job. You won't get unemployment benefits. And then he says, you'll be drafted on Tuesday. You will go to training camps in California, and I will make sure that you go to the Pacific. And anybody that's a World War II historian knows that it was a much horrible task fighting the Japanese in the Pacific than they were fighting Germans. By that time, the Italians would have left the war, so they wouldn't have been an issue. Then they bring in, to back up this threat, 5,000 men. These guys were on their way to Normandy. Yes, D-Day is over. You know what? The Germans are still putting up one hell of a fight in Normandy, and then we're losing men. So these men were going to replace those casualties. Now they're over here. They're in the car bards. They're setting up. That's a BAR, Browning automatic weapon, at the shops. They're going to ride the cars in full gear with fixed bayonets. Okay, the orders are to keep this system running and maintain order. I wish I could remember her name, but that woman is the first woman to take a car out. She will be harassed constantly by the union for being that, and she will get a job, another job outside the transit industry. The government will give her that because of all of the harassment that was going on. But the troops are riding. There's usually 2 or even 3 soldiers. They're jeeps running around this system, excuse me, making sure that everything's all right, keeping a look at it. And then, of course, some of our young civilian down here in the lower right want to help the soldiers. And she's getting on with his sister. And you notice his enamel pot that he has on the top and his own gun. So, and the citizens are more than happy. They're out there providing bag lunches, Pearl mail shaker, a thoughtful housewife. I don't know how that caption would go today in a paper, but she's giving these guys sandwiches and fruit and cake, and they're all happy. And of course, the soldier's got his cigarette, something else that you might not see in one of today's photographs. But they stay there. The soldiers stay there riding the cars for 6 weeks before they turn the system back over to private ownership. Well, the war ends, and as far as I could tell, PTC was the only company or transit system company that came up with a plan for their returning veterans, to bring them back into. Now, of course, it doesn't address PTSD, but it does try to reintegrate them in the company. The other thing that's going to happen is all these route changes that were done by the Office of Defense Transportation, many of them are going to be undone. They're no longer needed. And, look at the traffic. This was, I think somebody said this was a 1944 picture, which, is phenomenally unbelievable. But it's 46. And of course, gas rationing is over with. And this is just what's going to come in the future. They had curtailed all auto production, civilian auto production in 1942. The war's end comes, and they're going to start making the 1942 model. But there's going to be cars being bought, and many of our returning veterans will relicense their car that they have hiding in the garage, and they'll bring them back. And of course, there's all the hucksters and the horses and wagons are still out here on what I think is Baltimore Avenue. And more of this chaos that's not speeding up transit schedules, that's for sure. And now it's legal to strike. And lots of companies you'll find in the post-war period, immediate post-war period, strikes all over. So there is another big one, like the PTC, and they're looking for money. That was 25 or so, 25 issues. But the big one was a $2 a day pay raise. And the wives get out there. This is a classic picture. I love that woman's sign over on the right, because, I experience that all the time. I'm never right. But they're out there because they want their $2 too. Remember, there's been no pay increases for the entire time of the war. And we're getting post-war inflation here. The company is very confident. They have high ridership levels. And so they buy 100 new cars. They want to try to keep that ridership up. Not only do they buy these 2700s, were new, they buy used cars from St. Louis and from Kansas City, which are much cheaper. And those are fairly new cars and coming from cities that are going to get rid of their streetcars. Okay. They also had a plan to replace just about all of the old streetcars with either trackless trolley or bus, or abandon the route altogether. And, you get into 49 while they're coming up with this plan. And now the auto industry is retooled, and all this new stylish stuff's coming out. So the PTC is looking ahead. There's 73, which had gone to trolley, back to trolley, and it will now go back to being a bus. Okay, there's the Bernies. There were 5 of them left. They're all going to go away by 1948. They were used in shuttles. This is down in Upper Darby. And this was probably running on the 78 Yaden shuttle. Not too far from where I grew up, Route 65 on Old York Road. But what happens here is the company needed a value, and the Pennsylvania Superior Court determined it was $75 million. Aha. Now that attracts the attention of National City Lines, and National City is really at this point a fairly old company. Begins as Rex Finance around 1928. It incorporates as the National City Lines in 1936. And they use that capital to buy out small and mid-sized transit companies. So, I know people like to think this is an evil thing, but those small and mid-sized transit companies, they were already planning to get rid of their streetcars or completely go out of business. They started purchasing the stock of Philadelphia Transit in 1954, and they gained full control by 1955. And they replace in 31 months 35 trolley lines. So all the old cars are starting to go away. They buy with their money 1,000 GM buses. And this company and St. Louis and Baltimore, they were new purchases of rather large companies. This wasn't typical of National City, but that money, that looked pretty good. What they did to make money at first was sell surplus property. We don't need places for loops. We don't need wire. We don't need track. We don't need ties. We'll get rid of the guys that were putting them up. and that was the slashing employment. And then they were not easy to negotiate. Labor didn't like them. The city did not like them. This company did not play any ball with the city, and it was really sour. The relations would become sour and fragile and terrible. All this company wanted was they wanted profits for their company and dividends for their shareholders. So here are some scenes of what it was, what's going away um, in the 50s. And of course, the Nearsides ran, they would run last on Route 15, Gerard Avenue in 1955. This is Route 9. This is at Spring Garden Street. The car is on 22nd. I think he's going southbound. And we're down in South Philly here, Route 65. That was the line I used to ride. And we're down South Philly at Oregon Avenue. He's coming down 6th, South 6th. He's getting ready to make his loop. Ed Miller took this photo. He took many wonderful Philadelphia shots, and his detailed records tell me he was up in the summer at 7 o'clock on the line. So Route 37. This was the line down to Chester. The Chester Short Line had a lot of private right of way. This is 1940 down by Baldwin's siding. Baldwin Locomotive Works was down there, and this line would have probably gone anyway. But 1:18 in the morning. It's August 28th. It's 1946. We're crossing the old wooden Crum Creek Bridge with a crowded trolley, and it hits a truck full of paint and other supplies. And I guess the truck's motor in the front combusted, and there was a fire. Burned the streetcar, burned the truck. Nobody got hurt in this, but it also burned the bridge. That was the end of streetcar service to Chester. They would truncate it down to the Westinghouse plant in a place called Leicester. And that would get shortened even further later. There's the Route 20 loop. We're not too far from Luzerne Car House. In the back is Little Flower High School. And the car house is really between the White Building, the factory, and Little Flower. And this was an area at one time that the circus used to be held here in Philly. South Philly, Snyder Avenue, ran these big old things. These were the old Hog Island cars. You can tell by the number. These were the ones that could run multiple unit. Fox Chase, up in the Fox Chase area, was Route 26. And like the Old York Road line, at the outer end, this had the gutter running, and I can still remember this. And had about a mile of this. Fan trips would always come up here. I remember, who was it? Dennis Szabo showed me this. He pointed out down in the back where the track was coming out of the asphalt. And I took some pictures, of course. Why not? And he said 2 days later, people must have seen me do that, and they were covering it over with more asphalt so nobody would get hurt. So South Philly was full of narrow streets, east-west, north-south. This is on Ellsworth. It's a westbound car, I believe, on 11th Street. Typical row homes and small stores and corner stores here in Philadelphia. Another narrow street this way at Ridge Avenue on 32nd. Narrow east-west streets. Route 65 down in South Philly near Schneider Avenue. He's on 6th. But look at the crowds. Look at the traffic. It's just typical of the neighborhoods until they got rid of the Chinese Wall. This was the Pennsylvania Railroad that ran from 30th Street to Broad Street Terminal. And it had these low, narrow arches, which I'm sure when they built them, it wasn't a problem. It were horses and wagons. These cars would go through, and they had a device that would whap the pole down on the roof and keep it down until they came out from under the arch. And there was supposed to be sparks flying, and down at Route 52 here, this was at Ridge Avenue, and probably at some point after the Ridge Avenue cars went, they pushed the track over to the curb for a layover, and it got the tracks out of and cars out of the way of traffic. It's down at Midvale Avenue. This was a little segment on Baltimore Avenue where Route 46, ran along with Route 34. So we have an old and the new. So we've transitioned mostly to the new. Here is the Reading Railroad branch in Oxford Avenue. So the car is coming out of Fox Chase. And at one point, this was a nasty crossing. Double track went into single, cross with only a single track on one side of the road. And of course, this makes more sense. Probably increased traffic caused that to happen. We're downtown, Route 42. It's a very busy line. Walnut Street, it's a westbound car. The eastbound car ran off to the left on Chestnut Street, and we're down probably near Independence Hall. And this was a line that PTC wanted to keep. It was a very heavy line, and the city wanted to keep it as well. Now, had they in the 20s done what they were supposed to do and had a Chestnut Street subway, that West Philadelphia line would maybe running today. But the national cities basically put up their third finger on both hands. And despite what the city wanted, they stopped running trolleys after September 8th, 1956. Here's the Art Museum. And there's the steps over to the right where Rocky would assail the steps. And he's not going to do that for a long time. This is the early 50s, an undated photo of the tunnel that was under the Art Museum. And at one point, you could drive under it. Maybe you can still do that today. I remember driving through that tunnel, and it had become a one-way tunnel. But it just looked like the trolley subway in West Philadelphia. 57 wandered around different streets in North Philadelphia, twisted a lot, and that this is typically a Philadelphia neighborhood, the church, the row homes, corner store. Now, the bright spot was that there had been a move to extend the trolley subway beyond 30th Street, or really at that point, 28th Street or so. And the Depression killed all that. And then the war killed that move, and that work began again. And the subway opened up for trolleys on October 17th, 1955. They would extend the Market Street subway underneath to 46th, where it comes out today. And they would put two different subway terminals. Route 10 would emerge from one, and four routes would emerge down here at the 40th Street portal. There's the new subway getting ready to connect the tracks, or maybe in the process of connecting the tracks. We're looking east. This is May 21st, 1955. Here's a map of the subway and what they were doing. And, you ride through that trolley subway today, and there are some tight turns, and still, with four lines using it, they speeded up service tremendously. And there is the trolley coming out of the Market to the 36th Street portal up above. And that would cause the demise of Route 38. Because Route 38 ran all the way down Lancaster Avenue, and as you can see from the map, there was just no way to change that. Anyway, 38 would be replaced, I believe, by Route 36. And there's the portal for 40th Street. Much more elaborate today. SEPTA's done a wonderful job of cleaning that up. The old cars continue to disappear, and this was August 10th, 1957, and Route 52 was really the last line in Philadelphia to run these conventional cars. And so it had tiers on the cars, and they junked this car about a month or so later. Now you're down on Market Street, and the last conventional cars on Market Street. The last one was the last double enders. There are three lines running on Market Street: 17, 30, 20, and 32. They're either crossing north-south like the 20, crossing Market, or running along Market and then down into South Philly. That's the 17 and the 32. And all of this old car business ends December 28th, 1957. And on the next day, there wasn't one conventional car running. They were all down here. Maybe almost all of them were down here. This is the Bayless Scrapyard in South Philly, and they're stacked up, and, it's not a pretty sight. And PCCs are going. Some of the 2013 was one of the 1938 cars. that group went away. I know that National City Lines, which had sold the St. Louis cars to Philadelphia, they had a very weird braking system. Those cars went pretty early too. And this is scrapping them down at the Second and Wyoming shop. There's Route 62. It would continue to run this mile-long track between Yeadon Loop and Upper Darby, or not Upper Darby, but Darby Terminal. And I often wondered, this is a Dick Boker shot, and I wonder, was the cow waiting to pay its fare and get on? He really doesn't look like he wants to. So, well, what would happen is SEPTA is going to show up. The railroads are in trouble. And of course, there's 13 or 14 commuter rail lines, and they're very important, particularly to the 4 suburbs surrounding Philadelphia. SEPTA is going to be created to provide money for the railroad lines, and eventually they will want to combine all operations, all transit operations. So despite National City's protest, PTC is going to be bought out for $65 million in 1968 in September. And this is a fight that goes on in the courts. And today it's really, trying to do the best job post-pandemic, particularly of running unified system of trolleys and buses, subways, and railroads. And, I couldn't believe this shot on the bottom because I was there for hours. And anybody been out there at Lancaster and Girard knows the doggone traffic is horrible. And here is what I wanted. Because believe it or not, there are still 18 PCCs that are running. They're now being currently rebuilt from the frame up. And they're doing them. SEPTA shop people are doing a magnificent job. They're very, very proud of what they're doing. And these cars very soon should come back into service. I'm sure they'll still be running with buses. 18 cars is not enough, but they'll be back. Now, were there any Philly cars? They didn't all make it to the scrap pile. There's 5326 up above. And that's shot down below is 2711. And both of them run today at PTM, the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum. The orange car showed up after coming across the turnpike. And I imagine that was quite a trip under those low toll booths. A PCC came by on a truck, and that is used as our birthday car. And you remember 8042? Well, it also avoided the scrap pile. It belonged to Electric City Trolley Museum along with 8534. And graciously, ECTMA provided 8042 to the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum, where it is now undergoing a massive amount of restoration. And our friends, which are the Friends of the Philadelphia Trolley, Bill Monahan's group, Harry Donahue, and others have been raising funds. And what they do is support museum work at all of the various trolley museums that have Philadelphia cars, and they've been very generous with us. And as you can see, the car is going to look and run like a 1923 car when it was built. And with that, I'm here for questions. I'm here for criticisms. And if not, I'm going to go for trolley ride. I can do that here in Pittsburgh.